So for today's video, we'll be looking into SPC, Statistical Process Control, a very simple bit that I'm going to show you how simple it's going to be using Excel. Before we proceed using Excel, there's some information that you do need. Number one, the data that's given to you. If you look into my example here, I've got a very simple data here. 4 items for 5 samples. That's the first bit. The second bit, based on the sample size, you have to look into the control chart factor to get the mean factor, to get the upper range and lower range. I'm just going to share my screen here once again to show you the chart factor. This is something that will be given to you. You can even look up into internet to look for this information. So if we look into the sample size, as I've shown in my example earlier, sample size 4. So the mean factor is 0.729. The upper range is 2.282 and the lower range is 0. I've inserted the figures here for you to have a look at it as well. So let's take step by step. The first thing, when you receive a question like this, when you have a table like this, a sample size, and now you're going to look into the perspective whether is this items, are they in control or are they not in control? So we're going to look into 2 formulas here. Let's take a look into the first formula, which is X chart, and the second formula, which is R chart. So these are the 2 formulas that we will be using throughout the assessment. So to start with, as the items are given to you, you have to look into the average for each of the sample number. So from the previous assessment, I believe most of y'all know how to calculate the average. But once again, I'm going to show this to you so you have an idea. I'm going to delete the figures here. So the first bit, to have an average for each of the sample, I'm going to have an equal sign. I'm going to type in average, open bracket, item 1, which is B11. I'll drag it up to item 4, close bracket. And that should give you an average of 6 for a calculation of the sample number. So if you want to have a check, you can even use a calculator. And you're going to have 5 adding up with 3, adding up with 6, and adding up with 10 divided by 4. And that should be giving you 6. And to make things simpler, you could just drag it up to F15. And that would give you each of the sample, the average it has given you. And now you have to sum this up to order to get the average of all these 5 samples. I'm going to have an equal sign. I'm going to type in average once again. Open bracket, I'm just going to drag in from F11 up till F15, close bracket. So that gives you 6. And now let's look into the range. In order to understand what's range, I believe this is back to your statistics. You have to understand the difference between the max and minimum. So equivalent sign, maximum, open bracket, item 1, drag up till item 4, close bracket. You minus with your minimum. Once again, you open your bracket, and if in case it's quite difficult for you to drag it up, I would even suggest you to have typed in as B11, and you can have the semicolon as usual, and you have it as B, you drag it up to E11. So that gives you the range for the first sample. As usual, you drag it out up to the sample numbers, and at the bottom, average of the range. So I'm looking at the same bit. I'm going to go a bit more slower so you have an understanding, and close bracket. So pretty much this gives you the mean range, the average for mean, and the average for range. So that's where we now will proceed with the formula. For X chart, follow on with the R chart. So if we look into X chart, there are 2 formulas that I've gone through in your slide. One is with standard deviation and one is without standard deviation. So the one without standard deviation, since the question or since the assessment has not provided you a standard deviation, we'll be looking into this formula here. Upper control limit, lower control limit. I'm going to share back my Excel sheet for you to understand this better. So how do we insert this formula, guys? So if we look into what I've got here, number 1, we have the mean. I'm going to highlight this in yellow to give you a better indication. We have the range as well. So these are the figures that's already been calculated. And I've got these figures that's inserted from the chart earlier because we will be using these figures. So I'm going to highlight all these figures in yellow so you have an indication this is what we need. And in order to calculate the X chart, you do not need to memorize the formula. I will look into the one that I've already copied paste here so you have an understanding. So looking at this formula, the first step is the average of mean. You got to add or minus based on upper or lower. You got to take A2, which is the mean factor, and multiply with range, which is what's given to you here. So let's start with the first one. I'm going to take this off. Okay, let's start back. Okay, equivalent sign. So if we look into my question here, the mean is 6. And I'm going to have an adding sign, open bracket. We got to take A2, the figure of A2, multiply with the range figure, which is 8, the average range. And that's a close bracket. 11.8 will be the LCL. But what I would like to highlight here a bit more that you have to, since we're going to drag it off, we have to make sure we have a dollar sign in front of each one of these to stay constant. So in front of the B, there's a dollar sign. After the B, there's a dollar sign, and that appears the same for the mean, for the average for range as well. So this is how it's going to look like. I'm going to give you like 2 seconds to take note of this. And you click in enter. And now you just have to drag it up to sample number 5. And that appears the same for CL. CL is, to be very clear, what is CL? You might be wondering what is CL here. But I'm going to put on that, put that aside first. Let's move on for this bit here. UCL. UCL is equivalence again. As I was not supposed to have an added value here, isn't it? Supposed to have a minus figure since it's LCL, my bad. That's a minus figure. And then when you drag it over, it should be fine. And now for UCL, we got to use the same formula as what I have earlier. Your mean, you take up your mean. You have a plus sign, open bracket. We have A2 multiply with your range, close bracket. And between, you have to make sure you have a dollar sign. To get a dollar sign, guys, shift 4. Once again, shift 4, and that appears the same for the other bits as well. And that should give you the UCL. And in order to get your CL, it's supposed to be your mean here itself. So equivalent sign, you have your 6 here. And to make sure it's stagnant, once again, I'm going to have a dollar sign. That's it. And you drag it off. So moving on from there, once we have got these answers, we could even highlight this to make it look presentable. I'm just going to highlight this in a lighter color. Okay, once we're done with that, now we're going to move to your range. So if you look into my formula here for range, guys, we have got the upper and lower control. D4 multiply with R for upper control. So once again, I'm just going to delete this to make sure you have an understanding. What's your D4? If you look into my screen here, your D4 is 0. You multiply with your range. So to get your range, shift 8. That's your multiply sign. And you'll have to multiply with your average for, sorry, my bad, average for your range. And in between, you have to have the dollar sign as we will be dragging off to the other samples as well. Why am I doing this? Because it's going to be easier to illustrate your graph later. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit more tougher. So upper control limit, if you look into D4, and okay. D4 multiply with R, but I'm just going to check the figures of my D4, whether it's correct here. D4 is 2.115. 2.115, and this should be D0. And how do I know this, guys? From this table here. From the sample size, D4 is 2.822, and we have got the other bits as well. Okay, putting this lower, and now let me see. I'm just going to confirm this. Okay, D4. Okay, that's done. And now we're going to go for this supposed to be stagnant. So equivalent sign, you're just going to click on G15. But I'm just going to make sure it's constant. So I'm going to have a $ right before and after. And once that's done, you just drag it lower, and that's done. And for LCL, you got to make sure that you get this right by having D3 multiply with your range once again. So as usual, make sure you have got your $, and that will allow you to get the answer for each one of this. I'm just going to drag it over. Okay, this is not dragged enough, so drag it over as usual. And then you draw your box. Home page, let's have it presentable. And I'll have a different color, so we could differentiate these colors. That's our chart, and this will be the X chart. So we have 2 in bracket, and let's have it as blue. All right, so once we're done with this bit, what's your next step? Your next step is drawing the graph or illustrating the graph, whether is it in control or not in control. But before we move on to graph, let's have a quick recap on what we have done. Step number 1, this data is given to you. Up till here, it's given to you. Step number 2, you got to calculate the average for each of the samples. So if we have 5 samples, you calculate for each of the samples by typing in equivalence, average, drag in the item 1 till item 4, click enter. And once you're done with that, you just drag it up till the sample number. And once you're done with your X mean, you move on to your range. In your range, if you look into the formula, there's maximum minus minimum, making sure you have picked the right item before you proceed with the next bit. And once you're done with your X bar and your range, once you have calculated, look up into the average, because the ones that's highlighted in yellow, that is required to insert in your formula. So let's assume that we are done with this. We'll move on to the X bar chart. Insert the X bar chart, LCL, CL, UCL. Make sure you have an header for the X bar chart and R chart, and then you proceed with the formula. Proceeding with the formula, we have got it inserted here. I've put this up to make sure you have an understanding. You don't need this to put it up, but I just put it up so you can take a look at it. Substitute the formulas accordingly. Make sure you have a $, because we'll be just dragging it up for the next few samples. And once you have calculated your X chart and bar chart, let's now look into how are we going to draw the graph. How are we inserting the graph? That would be a better term to be used. So let's start with X bar chart. I'm going to highlight the X bar chart. I'll have a control here. And I'm going to highlight this X bar value, the mean of it. And I'm going to go for insert. When you click in on insert, look for the line chart. Insert line chart, the one line with markers. That will be the best option. And this would be your X chart. So click on the plus sign and make sure you have Access title being clicked. If you want to have labels, why not? And that should be fine. Okay, once we have this, we're going to have this titled as X chart. X chart, and this should be renamed as well. Okay, okay. I'm going to do this again because it just disappeared. Okay, I'm going to have insert. I'm going to have this insert. With markers. Xbar chart, X chart, insert. Okay. Click on the plus sign and make sure access titles are there. Data labels, if you want data labels, that should be fine. And then we're going to have this as X chart. And this should be your we don't have data tables. Okay. X chart. This should be your sample numbers. And that should be your sample mean. Sample mean, and that gives you the answer for X chart. And now to look into your R chart, you highlight your R chart once again. You click in on just the range, go for insert, draw the chart again, make sure you have a plus sign, access table, that will look right. And that should be your range. Make sure you're labeling your graphs. And this should be your sample range. Sample range and sample. And this should be a sample number. All right, that should be done. Okay, so this will be the X chart and range chart. Okay, if you look into what I've got here, make sure you have a clear conclusion at the bottom. If you look into all my figures or all my sample number up to number 5, it's all within the range of UCL and LCL for X chart and R chart. So, which means this process is in control and there isn't any further recommendation or there's any further investigation is required for this sample size. So I guess that's all from me today. I hope this clarifies on how to use Excel, especially for statistical process control using X chart and R chart. Thank you.